Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about the legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. And with this podcast episode, our 25th, we are beginning what I guess I can call our second season of Then There's California. And we look forward to another great podcast season of conversations with members of our distinguished Senate Democratic Caucus. In 2015, after an outbreak of measles at Disneyland and renewed reporting of an increase in measles cases and of the decline in the number of children being vaccinated and a growing skepticism among a small but influential group of California families who were convinced that immunizations can compromise their child's well-being, pediatrician and State Senator Richard Pan authored legislation that removed personal belief as a reason for exemptions for vaccination requirements for entry into a private or public elementary or secondary school in California, as well as daycare centers. Before and since SB 277 became law that year, California has wrestled with what has been described as possibly the most high-velocity outpouring of political dissent in recent memory. And while vaccination rates have increased in our state in the meantime, and several statewide polls have shown Californians strongly supporting strict vaccine laws and the need for vaccinating school children to help protect the public at large, the herd, the caustic rhetoric has not ceased. And neither have the demonstrations in the Capitol hallways, legislative chambers, and other public places. The weaponizing of social media, recall petitions, personal insults, and death threats against Dr. Pan and his family and the other legislators who supported the bill. And then reports surface of efforts by anti-vaxxers, as they're called, to take advantage of SB 277's loopholes, shopping for doctors who will give them a medical exemption from vaccinations, prompting Senator Pan to author this legislative session a couple of cleanup bills to curb the medical fraud. And with the introduction of these bills and their progress through the legislative process this year, California has once again found itself in the caustic position of being the worldwide epicenter in the debate over the safety and the need for vaccines, and in particular, anti-vaccine sentiment. On this edition of Then There's California, we welcome back to our podcast the doctor lawmaker who has found himself, or maybe you could even say put himself, on the front lines of this vaccination debate here in 2019, again, facing personal threats and physical attacks, but still persevering to try and convince and educate his fellow Californians and his legislative colleagues that public health is an important priority, and that sometimes, even when you think you're protecting yourself on your own, you're actually endangering others. Dr. Richard Pan is a pediatrician, former UC Davis educator, former state assembly member, and now state senator representing the 6th Senate District here in Sacramento County. Dr. Pan chairs the Senate Committee on Health and the Budget and Fiscal Review Subcommittee on Health and Human Services. Welcome back to Then There's California, Doctor.
Thank you. Great to be back here with you again.
You have had a crazy year, and even though your bills cracking down on the vaccine exemptions were signed by Governor Newsom, it came with a lot of personal risk. Are you sick of this yet?
Well, I ran for office to keep our community safe. As a pediatrician, I dedicated my life and my career to improving child health. So we cannot let people who engage in intimidation and bullying dominate our public discourse about what we need to do to keep our communities safe. The science is true whether you believe it or not, and the science is clear. Vaccines are safe and effective, and when we get vaccination rates high enough, that allows everyone in the community to be protected, especially people who cannot be vaccinated. We need to protect them.
You have been at the extreme end of this rhetoric and a lot of these personal threats. Has it quieted down since session has ended? I mean, a lot of people in the Capitol were worried about you. We're worried about themselves, frankly, considering the vociferousness of the rhetoric.
You know, it's disappointing that the opposition engages in this type of not only rhetoric but activity. We had someone attack me and assault me on a street.
Right.
We had someone for the first time in the history of the California legislature actually throw something from the gallery, throw blood onto the Senate floor. And this is not how we should be making decisions in the state of California. Clearly, they do not have science and facts on their side. That's why you do this, because when the facts are not supporting you, then there's no other argument. There's no debate. There is no debate. Then instead of debate, they engage in bullying and intimidation. And that is truly unfortunate. So you don't win by personally attacking a legislator and their family or their staff. That is not how we should be doing things. That's not how we should be making decisions. We actually discuss many issues which people feel passionately about. And it's important for people to express their opinions. It's even more important that those opinions be informed by facts and the science. And then we try to make the best decisions we can to keep the people of California safe, to try to make California a better place to live. And I think we did that in the face of an opposition that was vociferous, that engaged in bullying and intimidation, but unfortunately did not engage in actually providing any support or evidence for their positions.
Some of that rhetoric and the opinion masquerading as fact, the history and the perspective and the policy gets lost. And I would like to take us back to 2014, 2015, and the measles outbreak at Disneyland that happened at that time that kind of woke us all up to low vaccination levels in certain parts of California and the number of personal exemptions that were given by doctors and creating these pockets of unvaccinated people. In fact, there was even a story in the news this morning that there was a rumor of another person who has gone to Disneyland over the last couple of weeks who was carrying the measles disease. Disneyland seems to be our petri dish here in California. These stories come up frequently. But let's go back to that and what happened there and what prompted you to say, I got to put this mandate into law.
Well, first of all, I would point out that Disneyland is an international destination for people all around the world to come visit. So certainly it is not surprising that there were going to be occasions where someone would have a disease like measles and come visit Disneyland. What happened in 2015, though, what changed was not that someone visited Disneyland with the measles, was the fact that we had so many people who were unvaccinated who actually lived around Disneyland and was at Disneyland that the disease spread. And the disease spread across our state. And in fact, when scientists looked at where did the measles actually spread, it primarily spread in neighborhoods where there were low vaccination rates. And basically, if we don't get our vaccination rates up high enough, we have outbreaks. Now, interesting enough, after 2015, the people of California said enough is enough. In fact, parents called my office and said, what can we do about this? We do not want to see diseases spreading in our communities. We do not want to see our babies being exposed to measles because they're too young to get vaccinated. We don't want our children who are being treated for cancer or who have transplants or other conditions that they cannot be vaccinated to be exposed when they're attending school or going to shop or riding public transit. And they said, enough is enough. We need to be sure we get our vaccination rates up. And that's how we passed SB 277. Now, I would make note that after passage of this law, our vaccination rates did go up in our schools. So, in fact, over the community immunity threshold of 95% the first 2 years. However, what we also noted is that the medical exemption rate was also going up. In fact, the medical exemption rate has quadrupled since the passage of the bill. Now, if you think about this year, actually, as you said, there's been at least 2 occasions, so most recently just this past week, in which someone has brought measles and exposed people in Disneyland. I also point out that we've had measles cases show up at LAX. We've had measles cases show up in different parts of the state of California as part of a larger outbreak that has led to a record number of measles in the United States. We've had measles outbreaks in Europe where, unfortunately, I think over 80 people have died, thousands of cases. But I would also make note that because we passed SB 277 in 2015, we didn't have another outbreak like we had in 2015, where we had over 100 people get measles. So actually, the bill worked. So even though the bill is not even fully implemented yet, because it basically affected just each entering kindergarten class, but over even just the past 3-4 years, apparently it has helped provide that protection. Now, the problem is that, remember I said the medical exemption rate was going up.
Right.
So the problem is that just this past school year, we have dipped right below the 95% necessary for the protection we need, community immunity. And that's because of the medical exemption rate.
And that's why you have these unscrupulous doctors out there trying to make a buck and game the system by offering, even advertising for these exemptions. In fact, there was another story again in today's paper. A pediatrician in San Diego
actually not a pediatrician, by the way.
Oh,
this person's not a pediatrician.
Okay, but 1,000 exemptions, just that one doctor. Can you imagine that?
Yeah. So this one doctor was actually reported by the Voice of San Diego to have written a third of all the medical exemptions in San Diego Unified School District. And by the way, she is not a pediatrician. She is, I think, an anti-aging doctor, and was actively advertising medical exemptions on her website. And so what we saw was that we see physicians who basically have advertised medical exemptions, who are writing large numbers of medical exemptions that are basically suspicious. And in fact, that's why, as the medical board has been investigating, they are finding that these exemptions are inconsistent with standard of care. I would point out that, because I've had conversations with the medical board since implementation of 277, that it is very challenging for the medical board to do investigations because many of the families that are buying these exemptions refuse to cooperate with the medical board. They are in cahoots with the doctor in committing this fraud. And so trying to get the records to actually, in the investigation, to build a case against these physicians is very difficult. In fact, that's why part of 277, actually part of 276,
right,
the bill that I just did this year.
That's the one you did this year,
yes,
that would put a lid on the medical exemptions.
Right. Also helps provide some measures to allow the medical board to be able to better do investigations to clamp down on those physicians who are basically selling inappropriate medical exemptions.
And under the mandate of 276, it would bring these medical exemptions up for approval by a state board. Is that right? And it would be another panel of doctors that would perhaps rule on that or rule on the response or the critique of those exemptions, right?
Well, I think more importantly, we're providing oversight over the medical exemption, right? So, for example, your physician, actually, if you were applying for a handicap placard for your car, you would have a section filled out by your physician. That is then reviewed by DMV before they grant a handicap placard, which then prevents physicians from advertising that if you want a handicap placard, pay me $100, $200, $500, and I'll give you one, right? Unfortunately, there's been no oversight over the medical exemptions. And so what we saw was that doctors basically saying, give me $180, $500, whatever amount, and I'll write you a medical exemption. And that's not appropriate. They're supposed to exercise professional judgment. They're supposed to adhere to standard of care. In fact, that is the standard in SB 276. The very standard that we expected physicians to use in the first place, which is standard of care, is what is expected of physicians under SB 276.
Those opposed to this bill, the celebrities, the politicians, the moms that have been roaming through the Capitol all year, have said you were justifying their worst deep state fears, that you were taking the power of exemption and the health of children out of the hands of their personal doctors and giving it to this star chamber of bureaucrats.
Well, let's straighten the record out. First of all, interesting enough, this actually small number of privileged mothers who didn't want to get their children vaccinated would post on Facebook, my child's doctor won't give me a medical exemption, so I went and bought one. Okay, they're not talking about their child's doctor in most part. In fact, we see many of the people writing the exemptions, they're not people who normally take care of children. They oftentimes are writing exemptions for patients that they don't have an ongoing care relationship with. I would point out that the bill itself was actually sponsored by the California Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics in California. So the very physicians who take care of patients are the ones who sponsored the bill because they know that the current situation before SB 276 was dangerous to the public. They also know that it's important that physicians are held accountable when they put the public at risk. And that's why as professional associations, they uphold the standards of the profession, and they are asking the state to ensure that those standards are upheld and that doctors are held accountable. So think about it. The association that actually represents physicians, all right, both pediatricians and physicians in the state of California are saying, we want this legislation. We want this legislation because we know, unfortunately, there's a small number out there who are licensed physicians who are abusing their power, their license. They're abusing their license, and they're putting the rest of us at risk, including our own patients. And that's why we want this law.
A couple of dynamics on this I wanted to ask you about. You're a medical professional. You have been for a long time. Is it bothering you, or maybe I should rephrase this, how much is it bothering you that you are seeing your colleagues in the medical profession selling out like this and compromising their ethics, gaming the system?
First of all, I would say is the vast majority of physicians are doing the right thing.
And that's a good point to remember, that this is only a handful of physicians that are participating in this.
Yes, it's fortunately, it's a small number of physicians who have basically decided to monetize their license, have decided to basically sell out on their professional oath. And it's unfortunate. And we do see that occasionally, and that's why we have licensing laws. That's why the medical profession has standards, and when people violate those standards, their fellow physicians, they want to see those physicians sanctioned. And that's why the medical profession itself supported and sponsored this law.
Looking at the debate over this last year, and even looking back to the debate in 2015 on that bill and everything that's happened in the years since, has it surprised you to see the bipartisan opposition, the otherwise respected politicians or celebrities or advocates that are out there that you might otherwise be in tandem with on policy issues, pushing back so hard against you in this bill?
Well, I would say is that we can see that the vast majority of Californians of both parties, of different ages, demographics, backgrounds, support this legislation. So I would point out that when I did SB 277 in 2015, the PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California, a very well-respected organization that conducts polling, showed that 2/3 of Californians supported requiring vaccinations for school. So that was in 2015 after we had our measles outbreak. When I did 276, PPIC again did a poll and showed that actually it's risen to almost 3/4. So the people of California are saying no matter they're Democrat, they're Republican, their demographics, rich, poor, male, female, they all say that we want our communities protected. And in fact, a recent poll done by the University of California, Berkeley, showed that support for the provisions in SB 276 had over 80% of Californians in support of SB 276's provisions.
You had a couple of close calls, if you will, with the governor on this. You thought you were in sync with the administration. All of a sudden, via social media, the governor comes out and says, oh, wait a minute, we got some problems with this bill. Did that complicate things?
Well, certainly I appreciate the work with the administration and the governor on getting this bill passed. I certainly understand that the governor wanted to take a more targeted approach than the initial bill, which I'm fine with, because the goal of the bill was not to try to get every possible child vaccinated. The goal of the bill was to ensure we had a high enough vaccination rate to restore community immunity, that level of immunity that's necessary to protect everyone in our community, because we know that there are people in our community who cannot be vaccinated, right? I would point out that SB 276 is about protecting the children who actually need a medical exemption. So this bill is about restoring integrity to the medical exemption, ensuring that the children who really need the medical exemption are safe at school.
We have been so lucky in this country in the last few generations to have not had to worry about these extreme epidemics of infectious diseases like we did in the last century. I remember as a kid in the 60s, the polio vaccine, and many parents have never had to fear that circa 21st century. In fact, a lot of doctors nowadays may not appreciate the severity of the diseases and the immunization preventions that we've had over the last several years, the last few generations. We've eliminated so many of these diseases. There's one notion that's come up. Has our successful disease eradication and the vaccination process become a victim of its own success?
Unfortunately, yes, because people don't have personal experience with these really serious and deadly diseases. So you have people who are opposed to the bill said they want their children to get these diseases naturally. Think about it. You actually want your children to get these diseases, and you're fine with it being spread to other children. The level of lack of awareness of the seriousness of these diseases. I would point out that measles has killed dozens of people in Europe in the past couple of years, the measles outbreak. We're talking about Europe. Many countries have universal healthcare. They certainly have modern medicine, and yet people have died of measles in Europe. We are fortunate that in this last outbreak, we've had no one die of acute measles, although we've had people die of a long-term impact of measles called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, SSPE. So that's a long-term delayed effect. Yes, it is a frightening condition, because what happens is that this can show up years after you've gotten measles, and your brain degenerates, dementia sets in, and then over a period of months and maybe even a year, eventually you'll die because there is no cure or treatment for it. It's a very terrible outcome. And so people need to respect the fact that these diseases are out there in the world, and if we don't maintain our immunization rates, they will come back. And so I certainly hope that no one has to have personal experience with these diseases. I'll tell you, when I was in medical school, we were told that because of vaccinations, we would not see these diseases in the community. But yet this year, there was a case of measles at UC Davis, where I used to be a professor, where I ran the training program. And I would have to say, unfortunately, unlike myself, the residents and students at UC Davis got to see measles in real life as someone in the hospital with measles telling you how serious it is. Unfortunately, I had that personal experience when I was actually present in Philadelphia in 1991 during a measles outbreak that infected over 900 people. And so we need to remember how serious these diseases are.
Let's talk about the anti-vaccine sentiment. The overwhelming majority of American parents have their children vaccinated. And as we've said, the polls show a majority of Californians support the idea of vaccination. They support your bills. Every state has an anti-vaccine group. The sentiment is nothing new. It's been around for centuries, since the first vaccines were considered. How did all this take hold?
Well, I think one of the big challenges is that social media has driven people to the extremes on a variety of different issues. It has promoted conspiracy theories and allowed people to be in echo chambers where all they hear is the conspiracy theory. And so, unfortunately, with vaccines is that there are people out there who profit from pushing anti-vaccine mythology, who've created echo chambers on Facebook and other types of social media. They've drawn people in and basically have told these people that vaccines are harming children, that they are blaming their child's death or autism on vaccines, when the science has clearly proved vaccines do not cause autism, right? And so these parents who have been fed this information then become anxious and fearful about these treatments. And so it is important that we continue to not only educate the public, but also be sure that we don't create and allow these echo chambers to continue to exist, that we should not be platforming disinformation that will harm the public. Science is true whether you believe it or not. And so it's not an issue of belief. The issue is that what do the facts show? And the facts show vaccines are safe and effective, and they protect both the individual who receives them and the community at large. And so that's why we need to pursue public policy based on fact. Greta Thunberg, she wasn't talking about vaccines. She was talking about climate
Right, the
crisis.
young lady who came to the UN.
Right.
Yes.
She said, it's not about listening to me. Listen to the science. And so if we're going to make laws and policies that protect our community, we need to listen to the science, listen to the facts. That should be the basis on which we pass our laws. And I'm proud to say that that's what my colleagues did, and that's why this law passed. That's what the governor did, and that's why he signed this into law. And so 276 is now law. 277 is now law. We are going to keep our community immunity here in the state of California and protect the people of California, and hopefully that's going to occur in other states across the country. In fact, Maine and New York have also joined us, and hopefully other states will as well.
We talked again about the governor and his actions. He finally did sign the bills related to this legislation. There was some concern initially that the governor, in some of his public red flags that he raised about SB 276, gave the anti-vaxxer movement a little bit of energy and some validation, some agency, by appearing to question your legislation right along with them. Like, wow, the governor's supporting us. The governor has concerns too. Did that empower the opposition that perhaps the governor didn't even expect?
Well, the governor listened to the science and the facts. He is someone who's a champion for children. I think he understood how important it was to keep children safe at school and in our communities. And so in the end, he did the right thing. I would certainly appreciate that while he did have some concerns and that he wanted to make the bill more targeted, and was happy to work with him on that. The anti-vax movement, they didn't have facts or science on their side. They would claim that there were no fake medical exemptions written, yet they bring up as their chief witness the one physician who was actually placed on probation by the medical board for writing an inappropriate medical exemption. I think that kind of lack of awareness of what reality is didn't help their cause. The fact that they threatened and tried to bully legislators by mailing them bricks and shouting during hearings, again, is not compelling to say that you actually have something important to say if what you have to do is to scream it over committee hearings, right? Now, we have lots of people who come for rallies and are very passionate about issues here. We've taken on very important issues like poverty and housing and healthcare, and people are very passionate about it, and they should be passionate about it. But if we're going to make good policy, we also have to be respectful, and we have to be factual.
I don't want to ignore, I want to circle back on the issue of social media and the impact that this has had in this debate, fueling this debate. Yes. The gentleman that attacked you on the street streamed the attack on social media. A little further example in your perspective on how social media has become sort of a partner in crime, if you will, in some of the pushback and the attacks against you and the bill.
So unfortunately, social media facilitates spreading misinformation, disinformation, and also, unfortunately, seems to be creating a vehicle for bullying and intimidation. And I think that's something social media companies need to seriously consider. You think about, we're not just talking about vaccines. We know that our teens, by the way, suicide rates have increased by 60%. Depression, anxiety have increased by 60% among teens. This is during the very period in which social media most grew. We see the types of behavior that I think many of us have already experienced with just watching our social media feeds. I think raise concern for people across the country. So more needs to be done about that. We need to figure out how do we build stronger communities instead of allowing people to sow division. There are bot farms out there using vaccination as a source of division. I would point out that certainly promoting anti-vaccine talking points and trying to reduce vaccination rates, not only, of course, does that sow division, but also makes our country more vulnerable to disease outbreaks, something that foreign actors who do not wish us well would like to see happen as well. So we need to do more to defend ourselves against these types of attacks.
A notion I have brought up with you before when we have talked, and I'll bring it up here again in the context of this conversation, because you and your colleagues have been on the receiving end of this pressure and intensity and all the opposition to vaccines. People do not trust government. They are told by government, scientists, the medical community that vaccines are safe, the risk is minimal compared to the overall risk of transmittable diseases. But it's government that has a reputation of hiding facts from them, that hides facts about unhealthy chemicals. Big Pharma has been the catalyst for so much greed and malpractice, and the tobacco industry has been accused of hiding or deceiving the public about the negative effects of nicotine in electronic cigarettes. And so we're seeing epidemics of opioid abuse and health consequences of vaping, and it starts to take a toll on people's trust and security. So can you understand where the mistrust and fear of vaccines comes from? And how do you breach that barrier of misinformation and fear and get people to trust?
So first of all, I would point out that the evidence that shows that vaccines are safe and effective and that they do not cause autism comes from a wide variety of different sources. So if you don't believe the CDC, there are numerous studies that have been done in other countries that showed the same thing. These studies are supported by different funding sources. So we have studies that are not funded by, quote, big pharma. But I also point out that we really need to have a conversation in our society about trust. So certainly many times our institutions have failed us. And so on one level, certainly there are reasons for people to be distrustful. But if all you can do is distrust, then how do we come together as a society and as a community to solve problems? If we can't acknowledge what are the facts, then where is the common ground on which we come together? So if everyone can make up their own facts, opinions are what reign, then where is the commonality in which we come together as a country, that we come together as Americans and say, this is how we're going to decide what's best for our country. So hopefully that is something that we can do, and that's what we did around this issue, around vaccines. And really, vaccines are a means to protect us from serious diseases. We do not want serious diseases in our community. And we also need to take this approach to solve the other problems facing our community and our society. We talk about how do we keep our country safe from foreign interference? How do we be sure that our leaders are upholding the values that we believe in? We need to think about what brings us together, that we are Americans first, and that's what, frankly, my work has been about.
You had mentioned the support that you received, obviously, the governor signing the bills, your colleagues voting in favor of the bills through both houses. There was a newspaper photo of you in one of the last few days of session, and the caption said you were on the Senate floor closing the debate on the bill. And the photo shows you pretty much by yourself on the Senate floor, empty desks around you, closing on your bill. Your colleagues weren't there. It was a photo that went out, and it just made me think, were there times through this, did you feel like your colleagues were by your side through this process? They got the threats too, they got the pushback too. Did you feel like you were alone in this, that you were the solo writer on this?
Oh, no.
Well, that's good to hear.
I want to thank all of my colleagues, even the ones who didn't support the bill. For example, when I was assaulted in the street, all of my colleagues stood up and said, this is not acceptable. We can have our differences of opinion. We can fall on different sides of issues, but the bullying, the intimidation, the physical assaults, that's not acceptable. That is not how we should be making decisions in the state legislature. And I felt that support from all of my colleagues, no matter where they were on the issue. And I want to thank my colleagues for standing with me and supporting me and saying that, look, let's have the debate. Let's talk about the issues, but we should not be attacked and bullied for articulating what we want to try to achieve.
I loved what one of your Republican colleagues said the day of the closing debate, where he said, we may disagree, but we are not disagreeable.
Right. Yes, we do not have to be disagreeable, and we can disagree. But I also point out, and I appreciate the fact that the vast majority of my colleagues supported the bill because they recognize that that's what we need to do to keep the people of California safe.
Some positive response in the middle of all this. A few years ago, Time magazine placed you alongside Jonas Salk as a hero of vaccine history, so that was impressive. And just this week, it was announced that the California arm of the American Academy of Pediatrics has established an annual award in your name to honor an early career California pediatrician who excels in advocacy on behalf of California children. The award has been named for Richard Pan, MD. That's extraordinary. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. There's nothing more meaningful than being honored by people who know you the best. So these are my fellow pediatricians. They know the work I do. They knew what I was doing before I ever got in the legislature. So this is a tremendous honor to be recognized by my own peers.
Your life and your legislative portfolio are not all about vaccinations. Looking ahead at 2020, what's on your policy agenda?
Well, we have a lot of things we still need to tackle. As chair of the Health Committee and the Budget Subcommittee on Health and Human Services, we want to work to improve access to health care, improve the quality of health care. So we're actually holding informational hearings to look at how is access in our Medi-Cal program, which covers, by the way, half of all children, a third of all Californians. We want to look at how do we better be sure people have access to care for chronic conditions, especially behavioral health and mental health conditions. We want to be sure people have access to those services and that kind of help. We also want to be sure that our communities are safer against whether it's infectious diseases or other types of issues. I know we've taken many steps to be sure that we try to protect our communities against things like gun violence. We also want it on the public health side. I know there's concerns about vaping and the number of hospitalizations and deaths related to that. continuing to tackle the opioid crisis that's particularly hurting many of our communities, particularly in rural communities. We want to continue to work on that and be sure people have access to substance use treatment, and we've had hearings on that particular issue as well. So there's many issues to tackle, and then we can talk about continued steps toward addressing poverty, particularly child poverty. We have an informational hearing around access for people who need developmental services as well. And then worked on a bill that's still ongoing, to work on aging, because we have an aging population, believe it or not, here in California, the land of the young. We need to be sure that our seniors are able to get the help they need as well. And so there's a whole variety of different issues we need to continue to work on. But California, we're the 5th largest economy. We are actually growing faster than the rest of our country. We do lead, whether it's in vaccines or other issues. We are a leader in both the U.S. and in the world. We can talk about the climate crisis, many other issues where we are leaders, and we need to continue to do that here in the state of California.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you
really for your steadfastness against a lot of the rhetoric on behalf of science and fact. Thank you for the care that you give as a medical professional and a legislator to California.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you for having me here.
It's Senator Richard Pan from Sacramento. That's it for this edition of Then There's California. It's a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and great ideas and support from Martin Ashley and Bob Brulte and Brian Shadden and Rainier Cipiniano and McLeana Woods and Lisa Murphy, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Richard Pan, representing California's 6th Senate District in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Thank you for listening to Then There's California.